have to cure cancer. You know, they'd like it, but there certainly is, it's sort of, they realize there's a risk. But there are certain things that we are obliged to do. We have to give them a final report. We have to tell them of inventions created. We have to let them know that their funds were used appropriately, et cetera. My office, again, in tech transfer, we're the ones who have to tell them if there was an invention made. A researcher will usually, you know, have to, on our invention disclosure, which we'll talk about in a little bit, a researcher will be asked, what funds were used to create this invention? And if they were federal, give us the grant number, because we have to go back to the feds and say this federal grant created this invention. In exchange, the feds, again, they don't want the money. They'll let us take ownership of the invention, but they do want to write. They don't want us to turn around and try to enforce the patent against the federal government. They will ask that they have what's called a margin right. It's never been used in history, and it probably won't be for economic reasons, but technically the government keeps open the loophole that if the invention had the ability to greatly impact mankind, that they could march in and take over the invention. So you can imagine if we invented a vaccine and suddenly there was a pandemic, in case said, oh, we have the rights to this vaccine and no one's allowed to use it unless they pay us, the feds could, in theory, come in and say, no, for the betterment of mankind, we need that. But again, it's never been enacted. And then grant support. So that's the fourth area of things, again, which aren't necessarily sexy or exciting, but they're things that have to be done. Many federal grants nowadays, or particularly state grants or foundation grants, they ask for intellectual property plans before you get the money. It's part of the proposal. If something's created, how are you going to make sure that this follows down the continuum towards market? You know, if you find a new protein, do you have the ability to translate this into the clinic? If not, do you have a tech transfer function that can take this forward and put it in the hands of someone who can continue to develop it? And so we'll be asked for, you may one day hear the terms IPDP, Intellectual Property Disposition Plan, but those are becoming more and more vogue. It used to be 20 years ago, there was nothing like that in a federal grant. Some foundations, some, you know, states, but feds, they didn't care, it was basic science. Nowadays, it's how are you gonna make sure this gets down the continuum towards the market? So we ask, we help there. So those, again, those are sort of the necessary evils, things that every university has to do, whether they care about, you know, patents and startup companies, et cetera. What we call the value adds, the things that will be done to different degrees by universities, with, you know, Stanford and MIT considered to be at the forefront of being very entrepreneurial and innovative, and some liberal arts college or non-research universities sticking to the ivory tower. The value adds will be patent development, right? We will invest in patents, and we'll talk about what is a patent and what that costs. We will go for sponsored research with commercial entities. Again, some universities may philosophically say it's not something we're going to do. Others will say we're very interested in being involved with corporate development. License agreements. The license agreement is in many ways what people say what happens when we sell a patent. We can't actually sell the patent per law, so instead we give rights. We'll say that you can use this. Remember, a patent is something that restricts others from doing something. If you patent something, no one else in the world can practice it other than you, unless you let them. So we'll sell those rights. We'll go to Merck and we'll say, okay, we patented this molecule. If you'd like to develop it and ultimately hopefully sell it, you know, we want this much money up front. We want a royalty on sales, et cetera. So that's called a license agreement. And the final one, the one we do the less, remember, 400 MTAs, maybe 4 or 5 spin-off companies a year. Spin-off companies, again, you know, newcos, spin-offs, startups, all the different words given to them, enterprise development. But long story short, companies created, typically close to the university, they don't have to be by law, but I bet you 80% of them stay home, if you will, at least at the start, that are created based on an intellectual property, based on an invention or creation of the university that suddenly becomes a for-profit. And typically the university will take an equity position in there. So we have at Case, you know, we have a startup portfolio. The controller may call once a year, the conflict of interest committee, and say, what startups does Case hold equity in? Or they don't even call them startups, because by this time they may be a 100-person firm, but which companies were university startups in which we have some sort of proprietary stake? So again, those are kind of the new world and the exciting world to many people. Regardless of all the sort of exciting things, if you will, the process for us is the same. We ask for an invention disclosure. It's a one-page form, and it literally is what it says. Disclose your invention to us. You know, we can't work on it if we don't know about it. Likewise, we need you to sign it and attest that you are the inventor and you were at Case, et cetera, at the time. So we have a one-page invention disclosure form. It will be provided, you know, looks like many other forms, your name, your departmental affiliation. Usually there's more than one inventor, certainly doesn't have to be, but who the inventors are, what's the title of the invention, what's the short paragraph describing it. From there, you know, we'll begin our process, which hopefully we can show you visually here. We receive about 200 invention disclosures a year. So if you look at it and you say, all right, $300+ million worth of research on campus, and we receive about 200 inventions a year, The university then, of course, my office takes in those 200 inventions. We have 4 months to make a decision as to what to do with that invention, and that decision can be the simplest one, nothing. We can say, you know, it's nice, but it's worthless, right? We don't see a commercial opportunity here. Or it could be like, wow, it even has a commercial opportunity. Unfortunately, the patent world is already found this, right? It's not novel. We've done a patent search where we pay lawyers and it looks like we can't get patentability on this because someone beat us to it 2 years ago. And then the third can be, you know, again, the rare ones, but they happen, or it's great, it's novel, it's beautiful, except for you're not the inventor. You know, it's based on law. It's nice that you see the value here, but it actually is an invention held by, you know, so-and-so. Those are kind of the reasons why we may pass, but of those reasons, the one by far the most common is just that there's not a commercial opportunity. It's not that it's bad science, it's not that there isn't value to society in terms of being an incremental improvement to the state of the art of research, but we can't invest money and think that someone's going to go and license this from us, take it forward. We spend about $20,000 per patent within its first 2 years of lifetime. So if you give us an invention and we decide that it's a worthwhile endeavor and we go to our counsel, we use outside counsel, so we go to our patent attorneys, most of them are in town, but sometimes we use ones on the coasts for specific technology realms. We're going to end up paying about $20,000 again over the first 2 years, and that's going to get us to the point basically where the patent's been filed with the USPTO, the United States Patent and Trademark Office, and we'll enter probably a 3 to 4 year dark period where we really don't get much going on other than occasionally, maybe every 6 or 12 months, we may get a question from the patent examiner or what they call the first office action, in which they say, here's our cursory review, help walk us through why you think this is novel and valuable and non-obvious. So again, that's kind of our bar, right? We have to say, is this worth spending $20,000 on? And like all organizations, we have a finite budget. So what we're doing, we're looking at 200 inventions, and our patent budget is roughly, you know, call it $1 million a year. It's a little less, but if we have $1 million a year to spend, that would be 50 patents a year. But that, of course, I'd noted that that's $20,000 in the first 2 years. We have maintenance costs or continuing costs for older patent portfolios. So we probably realistically have about $800,000 a year that we can spend on new patent development, which gives us the opportunity to do about 40 patents a year, right? So 40 patents a year, if we get 200 inventions, that means we're only going to take 1 out of 5 inventions. Now, in reality, we try to backload the costs, if you will. I see we're going to get it up here. And in doing so, we're probably going to take forward about a third of what we see. We're going to, you know, we're going to guess or bet that a third of what we've seen is valuable. And so here's the process, right? We receive an invention, IDF, right? Invention Disclosure Form. On the right column, you'll see, let's assume, you know, 100% invention disclosure, so say 200 a year. But of every 100, we're going to pursue about a third. 33 of them will say, you know what, we are going to go forward with a patent on this. We're going to spend money. It's called a pursue under the university policy. And again, we're doing that because we hope that at some point, whether it's immediately or 10 years from then, we're going to license this to someone, you know. And in reality, what we're trying to do is we're going to find a partner. We're going to find somebody in the commercial world that says, this is valuable to us. We want to take on rights to this. We'll pay you rights, or we'll pay you equity, or we'll do some sort of exchange of consideration so that we can potentially commercially develop this towards the market and towards human use. And again, that's probably going to happen about 15 of the 33, right? So we're going to get 100, 33 we're going to keep, 2/3 we're going to pass. We're going to give them back to the inventor and just say thanks but no thanks. Of the 33 we kept, 15 will go forward. So we're only right about 40% of the time, right? Even setting the bar high and saying we're only going to take 1 out of 3. You know, 18 of those 33, nothing will probably ever happen with. If you know, in retrospect, Monday morning quarterback would be great to get our money back. It wasn't something that ever panned out. But of those 15, you know, about 2 out of 3 times we'll break even, that the commercial party will make enough money to pay us back enough in what our contract read to at least have covered our patent costs and some of the costs of the transaction. And, you know, and of those 15, 5 will actually, you know, make significant money, where it could be hundreds of thousands of dollars. It literally could be hundreds of millions of dollars. It's rare, but it's kind of what we call the golden apple phenomenon. About 1 out of every 1,000 inventions, so every 5 years or so, we're going to see something that kind of has a strong commercial impact ultimately. And that impact, especially in the biomedical space, is probably going to occur, you know, 10 years downstream. but because you have to go through the FDA and you have to go through all this long development process. But when that happens, it's not uncommon to receive tens to $50 million a year. So there's been one patented case, one invention really. It was to a gene in the early 90s, one of the first genes cloned, that was used in protein expression in the recombinant industry. And it was used in several products, the most famous being Rituxan, which is a pretty common drug. And cases probably received over $150 million in the last 6 years or so on it. And the inventors get half, right? So this is, again, we call it the golden apple phenomenon. It's 1 in 1,000. It's a little better than a lottery ticket, but it certainly isn't something that's going to happen often. But when it does, it can be transformative. Emory University kind of set shockwaves through the world about 4 years ago when they sold off a patent portfolio that had held up to a court challenge. And when they did, they sold it off one time for $530 million cash. It was a one-time $530 million settlement, which is obscene, that amount of cash, $500 million plus coming to a university. So this is, again, what sort of the dollar signs in the eyes at times that can be good and bad at universities that exists. So if you're going to do this, I talked about the Invention Disclosure form, right? You have to let us know it exists. You have to assign it to us. What else do you have to do? Well, the primary thing, and I probably have these in the wrong order, participate in patent preparation and prosecution. It's a lot of work. We find that there's kind of two classes of people. There's people inventors or researchers who could be inventors, if you will, who don't like patent prosecution and do it once and say that was a hell of a lot of work. And there are others that just love it, and we've literally had 20, 40 patent filings from them. But what happens in this, again, we use outside counsel. We hire a lawyer. The lawyer comes in, sits down with you in my office and the inventors, walks through the invention. All these patent attorneys by law have to have a science background. The USPTO is very strict. They'll actually call up the universities, look for transcripts. So they're pretty strong scientists, especially, and most patent prosecution attorneys choose a niche, right? He or she is famous in the world of GPCRs or or transmembrane proteins or medical software. They'll find it a space in which they're very knowledgeable, and a lot of researchers will be stunned. They'll say, "Wow, he or she really gets it. This is impressive." But they'll sit down, they'll sort of grill you, they'll really try to tease out or discern what's the invention. And then they'll create, it's a 40-page document at least, and they'll send it back to the inventor, and they'll say, read this and tell me if I have it right, and B, if we need to expand it more, if I'm missing things, and so it can be a lot of work on a researcher, and it needs to be that way. But that said, that's one of the things you have to do as an inventor, right? If you're going to partake in this. Hopefully, then, at the time we decide to go forward and try to potentially find that commercial partner, you may be involved in helping us find those licensees. If you look at the spectrum of possibilities, there's the rare case where you know nothing. You say, look, I know it's my duty to disclose to the university. I don't consider myself commercial or entrepreneurial, but I thought I'd tell you this, and you guys decide if there's a commercial partner. And that happens, right? It doesn't. What's best or ideal is when you're on board too. And a lot of times the researchers, especially the more senior researchers, not only understand who might be the potential user of the technology, but they even know those people because over their decades of going to conferences and that, they've established those networks. So they'll say, well, I was at a conference presenting this poster, and my colleague from Pfizer came up to me and said, we're really interested in this, so I gave him your card. So that a lot of times you're actually helping find the partner, if you will, down forward. In doing so, you may help us, you may assist us in developing those marketing materials. We may want to say, look, we're not going to send out the patent. First of all, it's too much to read, and we may not want to share that yet. But we're going to develop what's called a non-confidential description, usually a one-pager, because business isn't going to sit there and read through in depth at first. And we're going to use our network of business development professionals and send this out and just make sure we kind of hit the highlights and you think this is, A, that it's technically correct, and B, it makes sense commercially. If the inventor is presentable, and we hope they are, especially for early stage inventions, the potential licensee is going to want to meet them, because rarely is the licensee saying, this thing's all wrapped up in a box, it's ready to go, all we need are your commercial rights, and that's it. Usually they're saying, well, if we did license this, we're going to need access to the inventors. We're going to need to, have our scientists talk to him or her, regularly, especially at the early stages, as we try to, recapitulate or take what was done at Case and see if first it works in our labs, and if so, develop from there. And so, you know, the ability of them to develop that relationship. And again, most inventors want that. They don't want to think their baby's gone. If they invented it, we sold the rights to Pfizer, and they'll never see it again. So a lot of times they get involved with sort of downstream development with the company. And then finally, you know, the world is usually, oh, we found a licensee, everything's great. A lot of times there are questions, you know, these relationships turn bad at times, you know, especially I would say the thing we need to really be careful for ethically as well as financially is that the commercial party that licensed the technology is diligent in developing it. We don't want them to shelve it. We don't want them to say, well, we bought that patent portfolio from Case or licensed it from Case so that we could keep it from our competitors, and we have no intent to take this to the patient, but it protects our product that's on the market. And we at times need the inventor to say, they're saying that this is why it hasn't made it to market yet, that they're having trouble with solubility or with, you know, it's looking bad in this animal model. You know, what do you think is the scientist and is the person who probably knows this better than anyone else? So again, as an inventor, as you know, if you invent, you will be potentially involved in any and all of these activities. Is there an upside to it? Yeah, I mentioned already, right, the money. Half of the Case, half of what is received by the university in terms of net income goes to the inventors. So again, rare, but there we've made people millionaires. Some of it is just, you know, the first slide, or well, the slide you didn't see, it was a really good slide, by the way, the convenience and necessity of it. You know, some of these things you're just going to have to do. If you want to be an NIH-funded researcher, if you want to work with industry, you know, these are things you're going to have to do because they're important to the funder. The educational process itself, a lot of times, again, usually over your career you develop more understanding of what it takes to translate something downstream, but at the early stages sometimes we're seen as a group that you know, is kind of a Swiss Army knife for translation, and a researcher will come to us and say, here's what I found, I love it, etc. I have no idea how to get clinical samples from another institution so that I can prove this out, you know, in a sample size or in a sample population that makes sense, and we can help educate on there and find that. Industry access. Similarly, sometimes they'll say, I have this hypothesis, but the only way to test it is if I could get this drug, and this drug's in development. You know, I read about it in the journals. Pfizer owns it. How can I get it? And we'll usually, you know, contact our peer at Pfizer or others and can help, you know, say, can we access this? If so, under what conditions? So I mentioned startup companies, right? These are really important nowadays to a lot of regions, and they're particularly important culturally to universities. Case, again, we're nonprofit, right? And a lot of people will tell you what that really means is we don't pay taxes, right? We try to make a profit, but we're non-tax paying. And if you look at Cleveland, you say, well, especially, you know, in this day and age, Cleveland's 3 largest employers are nonprofits: the university hospitals, Cleveland Clinic, and Case. So we sort of are seen, you know, whether it's ideal or not, we are in many ways, the economic engine of the region, of the county. In doing so, we're tasked with, especially since we're not paying taxes, they're going to say at times, you know, what are you doing to create jobs, to retain students, you know, so that when they graduate, they don't have to leave the region. Startup companies are sort of that poster child for that. Again, we're only going to do 4 or 5 a year, usually. There may be another, you know, 3 or 4 that come out of the institution that aren't done through the formal transfer process. But in theory, you know, you're looking at, you know, 4 to 8 companies a year that Case could say, if it weren't for Case being here, these companies wouldn't exist in our region. They will start usually with 1 employee, right? There'll be, and sometimes it's a half-time employee. But they can grow. You know, Athersys hit over 100 employees, Arteriosite's up to 80 employees. So they have this sort of, again, they're almost a poster child for opportunity. Many of them go bankrupt or they go out of business, right? That's the part that isn't sensational, but it's the more likely reality. The median value of a startup, 0. Most of them are going to be worthless because they're high risk and it's very hard to find money. But again, they are that hope springs eternal, and they sort of culturally are important to universities in the economic development world. They're also important to faculty members. A lot of times a faculty member will create a startup or want to create a startup, not because he or she wants to be a CEO or thinks they can get rich in equity, but rather they'll say, I believe in this technology, and it's too early for industry to take it over. You know, Pfizer and Merck or Medtronic just aren't interested. They are just saying, we haven't had any proof of concept. You know, industry considers early stage of phase 2 data. You know, universities consider early stage, you know, pre-patent in a petri dish, and they call that the valley of death at times. That gap between where the feds will pay to get it to a point and where big industry will take over. And what's really come in that world of where you've probably heard at least the term venture capital and angel capital. There's a for-profit world of startup companies and private capital financing that can really be put in place to continue development, to get proof of concept's a big word, right? To at least get large animal studies or show that you can manufacture it. You know, some people even consider, again, phase 1 studies at least the very beginning or the end of proof of concept. You're showing at least that it's safe and tolerated in humans. And you need that commercial chasm, or you need those commercial sector to fill in that chasm between where commercial parties play and where federal funding will stop at universities. So again, startups are sometimes the only way to go forward, and that kind of ties into translational development opportunities. Sometimes the only way to continue translation is to do it with the for-profit world, whether it's creating your own startup or whether it's partnering with industry. And again, tech transfer functions will usually play in that role, if nothing else, to be the contract overseer, but hopefully more of us in a service sense as well. So this is important for you here as students and researchers today, but then also most likely anywhere you go, at least in the US. If you work at a university or a company, you will not own your inventions. I mean, it's going to be part of your employment. Some places will make you sign when you get employed, a confidentiality agreement as well as an assignment of all your intellectual property. Others will say it's implicit in your contract that we don't sign secondarily. It's already part of you being employed. So a case, we're in the latter group. By nature of you taking a check or enrolling as a student, you subscribe to all the university policies, right? And those policies aren't just IP, security and drug use, et cetera. But one of those is our intellectual property policy. And in the intellectual property policy, it says that if you invent anything, through your job or using university facilities or resources, that it belongs to the university. Same for faculty, same for everyone. But in a nonprofit world, and again, this is different than in for-profit. If you invent something, it's a value, you might get a plaque on the wall, you might get a gift certificate to a local restaurant, but that's about it. In a nonprofit world at universities, you'll get a cut. Again, at Case, you'll get half of the return. So there's sort of that carrot out there for being part of this system. And again, that really found its roots in Bayh-Dole. Bayh-Dole is the piece of federal legislation that allowed universities to take ownership of inventions, which is the world we live in. Up till 1980, the federal government owned the inventions. So there was no tech transfer at universities for the most part because everything we were inventing was owned by the feds, and it was up to the feds to do all the things that we're trying to do today, which is create value from this. When they realized that wasn't working, the federal government changed and said, okay, let's let the universities, not even really the universities, let's let the recipients of federal funding take ownership of inventions as long as they meet certain conditions, which I touched on, which are reporting and giving rights to the government and marching rights, et cetera. So, and part of that act said you need to share with the creators. So that's really the origins of why universities are very, generous with respect to inventors. Again, we showed this on the funnel. The majority of patents are going to be worthless. And it's not just us. I mean, we're pretty bad at guessing the future, right? We're dealing with early stage, but the industry itself, if the USPTO has a database of literally thousands of patents, academics and consulting firms and that sort of prophesize or speculate that about 75% of all patents are worthless. They're not practiced. So Lubrizol or General Electric file hundreds of patents, but they probably only use 20% of those because it just doesn't work. It turns out that the product didn't work or the market wasn't there. But so a lot of these are worthless. Those that are licensed, again, most aren't even going to return, and we hope to break even. We hope to make some return, but that golden apple phenomenon, 1 out of 100 deals or 1 out of 1,000 inventions can be really transformative. Outside of money, I touched on this, right? There's a cultural significance. The university wants to be innovative. The university, not just wants to be innovative, we need to be innovative, especially in the world of medicine where you have an aging population, you have, healthcare costs that everyone just says aren't maintainable, that there's going to be an implosion. We already have access to healthcare issues where people aren't receiving it, and then the cost of healthcare goes up every year, and innovation at times is seen as a curse rather than a cure. So there's always this, how do we innovate and create technology that makes healthcare better and cheaper rather than just adding cost to the system? And they look to academic medical centers and universities to be part of that. You know, one of the things I haven't talked about is just the personal cultural creativity. A lot of researchers they do consider themselves entrepreneurial, and they want to have a startup company, and they want to say, I'm the CEO or founder. And part of it is just, we joke, it's the midlife crisis phenomenon, right? They can't all afford sports cars on university salaries. So when they turn 45, you know, their first thing is they want to get tenure. Once he or she gets tenure, one day they say, well, what else can I do? I don't want to be chairman. Oh, I want to have a company. My college roommate has a company, and he seems to enjoy it, so it's my turn to have a company. So, you know, it's an outlet to help keep faculty from having to choose between, do I want to jump to the dark side to industry, if you will, or to stay with the university. It can be very important to them. I noted this throughout, right? Sometimes it's just, it's outside of the money, it's just access. I want to try this new drug, I want to collaborate with somebody with this new imaging modality, we can't afford it or it's not for sale yet on the market. How can I do it? And one way is through a tech transfer mechanism. And then finally, translational funding is growing, again, partly because of the healthcare crisis, partly because of the economic crisis. Everyone's looking for return out of the early stage research, and that gap to fill, again, is kind of sometimes considered, you know, translational funding is what needs to fill that gap, that valley of death. So how many of you have heard of the CTSA? Are any of you CTSA funded or involved? So this is the federal government's way of enticing or maybe compelling universities to become more translational, to develop things more towards the patient. It's called the Clinical Translational Science Award, CTSA. They were started a few years ago, and they're huge money. I think Case's first award was over $80 million. They're programmatic funds, so it's not research funding for just one, you know, hypothesis, but rather it's to develop the infrastructure at an academic medical center that allows continued development. Coulter's another, it's a foundation base, where foundations particularly, usually they're disease foundations. In the case of Coulter, it's more of a industry foundation, if you will, where they're saying we want to develop biomedical engineering research towards the market, but they're becoming more and more important because federal government dollars are shrinking with the war and with the economic conditions, and B, again, because of this disconnect between the for-profit world and early stage research, you're seeing a lot of foundations be created to try to fill in that gap. Myelin repair foundations and others such and these can provide millions of dollars a year to researchers in universities. As students, this is always my favorite slide because it always starts, we say, oh, students own their own things. Students aren't unlike faculty or employees, students own it. And then the policy, though, says unless, and it gives a whole bunch of carve-outs, which pretty much carves everything out. If you're acting as an employee, so if you're a research associate or if you get a check from the university and the invention came about through that service, then, you know, you being an employee supersedes you being a student. So and part of this, I think, was the university realizing a lot of their administrative staff will take night classes at Weatherhead or that, and they don't want them saying, oh, but I'm a student, I own it. So, you know, if the creative invention was, if the Inventive Act came about through your employment, the university owns it. Even if you're a student, you're not being paid, but the research you're done is funded through a external contract with the feds or with a corporation. Again, you don't own it. And again, that probably legally makes sense because the federal government or, you know, Medtronic or General Electric is going to say we're funding so-and-so's research lab, and he or she, you know, will do statement of work as, you know, Exhibit A, and we have certain rights to intellectual property. So we want to get a student involved because it's good for the student. If the PI wants to get the student involved, it's because it's good for the students. You know, we can't then say, oh, but wait, now that they're a student, we've either violated that contract with the outside entity, or, you know, so we say, look, if you're a student partaking in a funded research project, the elements of that funding project, the contract supersedes. And then finally, there are certain class projects, right? Especially in engineering, you get senior design projects, and they purposely go out to industry and say, give us a challenge in industry, and we'll give the students a 4-month, you know, a semester-long project to try to design away from this problem or to create a solution. And those, again, will they will obviate that the students don't hold IP, because otherwise the company wouldn't give that challenge and give that background IP towards the university. So ultimately, if while you're a student here you have a great idea for a business or an invention, you know, it's yours if it just happened to be, again, through your own capabilities. But if that invention came about, again, because it was under a research program or because you're being paid to do that work or because it's part of a project that's tied to industry, you're not going to have rights. You may have rights, but those rights it's assigned to ownership and goes to the university. So simple answer, if and when you have an invention, let us know, and we'll either say, yeah, that's yours, and be careful of X and Y, or we'll say, yeah, that's the university's, and here's what it means to you. But for the most part, we don't see too many students coming with inventions, partly because they probably don't have to or want to. When they do, once in a while, we'll say that, it's yours, it's completely yours, you own 100%. If you want the university to take ownership, we'll take it on for you. And remember, and what that would mean then is you'd get half instead of 100%, but we pay for the patent, we do the contracts, et cetera. So sometimes, a student will elect that. And likewise, we have to elect that, because sometimes we'll say no disrespect, but we just don't think there's much value here, keep it, and I hope you prove us wrong, but we're not going to take on the patent costs. But again, long story short, if you ever have questions, we're glad to always look at it. So why patents? Why some people say, shouldn't we just let things go to society? Why patent something? A patent is a restrictive element. Well, in reality, a patent is kind of paradoxical, but a patent really, at times, is seen as the only way to make sure that it does go to the public. There's kind of the what they'll call the commons, the reasons patents exist, and really in the Constitution, they kind of set the groundwork to create patents are they don't want people keeping secrets. If you had a business and you have a new way of producing something or curing someone, if there weren't patents, you might be incentivized, from a fiscal standpoint, to not let people know about that, to only to keep it a secret. And then, when your business goes away, or when you die, that's lost from society. So instead, the feds say, I'll tell you what, we'll give you a limited monopoly. We'll give you 20 years of exclusivity in which no one else can use this. But once those 20 years are up, that invention belongs to society. So it's kind of an exchange of rights. And, they use it. It's a cute axiom. I don't know if it's true, or if it really holds in the patent world, but they'll tell the story of, the Stradivarius brothers with the violins, and they'll say, in lore, those were the greatest violins ever, but no one can recreate those. And they're saying if there was a patent system, maybe they would have, reduced the writing how to do that. They would have had a 20-year monopoly, but then now that would be part of society, and instead it's lost forever because it was a trade secret, because it was never, shared with the rest of the world. So, sometimes we'll tell a researcher, it may sound paradoxical, but you should share this. The second side, and they'll say, well, then why not just publish it? And we'll say, well, the reality of it, especially in the drug world where it costs so much, anyone want to take a shot? What do you think it costs to develop a drug from creation to market, according to pharma? There's a good study every year comes out of, how much? Yeah, just about. They'll fight. Somewhere between 250 and 600 million people will say is what it costs to take a drug forward. And the skeptics are those who say pharma's just crying the blues, or they'll say that's because what pharma will do is say we spent $3 billion developing drugs and 10 worked, so it's 300 million a drug. And skeptics will say, yeah, but that's because they're counting all the failures. If you have developed just one, it only costs 80 million. But the reality of it is very expensive. And if you don't have a patent on an early stage opportunity, pharma just won't even take the risk going forward. So if you want it to make it to society, you have to protect that, right? Otherwise, no one's ever going to spend the money it takes if they can't get some sort of protection. Again, so hundreds of millions of dollars to develop a drug or medical intervention, and they're really required in order to drive that exchange and that investment by the private sector. So again, they really do align with the mission of disseminating knowledge and advancing the state of healthcare, even though, again, historically and philosophically, some people think it's the opposite, right? I don't want it. Once about 1 out of 100 researchers will say, I don't like patents. I want things to benefit society, and again, it can be a little bit difficult for them to understand. Second's exposure, right? The universities realize, especially with our healthcare partners, that being on the cutting edge of research is important, that both for, the ugly world, if you will, of just when it's about dollars. The universities need money from their alums. Universities do a lot for development and stories to tell about we're the first group to cure blindness, or we found this new drug, that has promise for Alzheimer's, are very important to universities. Likewise, our clinical partners want to be seen, the clinic and UH as being at the forefront, these what they'll call tertiary care hospitals. They want to say we have more innovative therapeutics and development than any other, hospital in the state or whatever. So they're important. We invest in this. We invest $1 million a year in patents and in my office, et cetera, because it leads to opportunities for goodwill and for publicity, even outside of just the return on a given invention. And I talked about this before, right? $20,000 in the first 2 years, probably about $30,000 over the lifetime of a patent. That's only in the U.S. There's no economy of scale. If you want the U.S. and Canada, assume 60,000. If you want the U.S., Canada, and England, 90,000. It gets very absurd. So foreign rights we rarely preserve foreign rights after 2 years, unless a licensee has come up and is willing to pay that. But it's very difficult. If we're in about year 3 or 4, which really is the time when the EPO, the European Patent Office, and that make you start really ponying up the big bucks to keep prosecution alive. Prosecution's the name for developing your patent. It becomes very, very expensive. And so we have a few patent portfolios that we spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on, several hundred thousands on. And those are the exceptions because it's just prohibitive. We just can't do it. Again, under by Dole, which again is the piece of legislation, we have to do this. And same thing, even if ethically universities didn't care, and we do, but if a company said, we're going to shelve this, but we'll give you a lot of money and make it worth your while, or let us shelve it and we'll give you a whole bunch of money for research, we're not allowed to do that under the federal government. The federal government says we have to get a fair market exchange and that we have to do our best to require disposition of the technology. And again, so in return, in terms of this, to put the money thing in context, most university offices don't break even. About 2 out of 3 don't break even nationally. The average return for a university is, I think it's 2% of the research, right? So your research expenditure. So if Case spends $300 million a year on campus, the average return for a university is $6 million or so. But the median return's negative. And what it is, again, remember that golden apple, that portfolio, is there's 20 universities a year that are making big money. And there's, again, 2/3 that are losing money, but overall the portfolio balances out to slightly positive. But the median value is a negative return. It's why it's so hard to find partners, because the technology doesn't have if there was a very strong return in tech transfer, then the private sector would invest in it. There would be a lot cheaper capital because they'd say, hey, we can make 12% developing early stage technologies a year. The problem is they can't. That's a negative return to the portfolio. So it makes it very difficult. So we aim to break even. We're a cost center. That we're not, again, occasionally we get in a situation where we're hoping we're going to make a lot of money either on an equity conversion or on royalties, but it's the exception, not the rule. You're going to get conflicts of interest for a full hour, so I'm not going to spend much on this slide other than to say that, there is a bit of a paradox that the federal government in ways and society is talking out of both sides of its mouth. It's asking us to be more translational, more commercial, create more companies, take more things into the clinic in which we have ownership rights and we were the inventors. But by the way, we're scared to death of conflicts of interest. We want publications, we want the public's very afraid of, particularly at the level of clinical care, of some of the relationships doctors have with companies, but even at the research level, are you taking federal funds and really are you just a shill or a pawn for Pfizer or Merck? So you kind of have on both sides of this tension between we're worried about these conflicts, but we want you to do more in terms of public-private partnerships. And so again, it's particularly difficult, and going back earlier about how important goodwill is and something to, for media to have positives. We don't want to go the other way and be the group that got us on the front page of the New York Times or something because of, ethical violation by one of our researchers or improper relationship with a drug company. Outside the individual, at the departmental and university level, again, revenue still exists. If half goes to the inventor, that means the other half's going to the institution. It's great for recruitment. I'm amazed at how many times I sit down with chairs who are being recruited who want to know about what's my office's function, what's our track record, what can we do for them, what are their rights as an inventor. I already touched on the regional development, developing a tax base and creating jobs for our people. Publicity, shared resources, and at translational culture. It's probably my last slide. This is a fun one because most of you obviously are dedicated to science and research, and it can be very frustrating. If we go back to that funnel, remember, and as a matter of fact, I'm going to do it real quick. Tech transfer is typically not a very popular function. It's just about any institution. You got to have a thick skin to play in this world. And the reality of it is that we let people down all the time, or maybe we don't, but the system is just such that it's a high failure rate. That people talk about the adage of if you hit 300 in baseball, you'll be in the Hall of Fame, right? So 3 out of 10 times, you can fail 7 out of 10 and be considered a Hall of Famer. Well, it's even harder in early stage technology. For every 100 inventions, 5 are going to create some sort of income flow. Roughly, and those again are kind of all based on national standards. So that means, 95 out of 100 times, the hope or the desire of when that faculty member, that researcher first filled out their invention disclosure form, it's not going to meet their expectations. And most times it's not even going to break even. And then a few times they're going to be like, what, I'm getting $80 this year? I thought it was going to be $1 million, right? Where's my down payment for my yacht? And it can be very difficult. It's a very, high risk, again, 1 out of 20 inventions will actually capture some value. So because of that, it's people say, well, why is it? Why are you guys 19 out of 20 times? Why isn't my technology worthwhile? Because they liked it in the publication and that, and it really is because the best research and the best technology doesn't win. It's not sufficient to capture value. So there's just a literal cost of capital issue that, again, if you want money, if you have an invention and you go to a venture capitalist or to an angel capitalist or to a bank, well, bank's not even going to give you money in this day and age. And they're going to say, those who even believe in the technology, they'll say, well, I want, because there's so much risk inherent with your invention, I want a 40% a year return, which means if I give you $1 million, you better give me $400,000 a year back on top of that. And it leads to such a, the cost of capital is so high that most things are just obvious. They say this doesn't have that sort of trajectory, right? So other than big blockbuster drugs and that, there's just not a capital market that you can make money in this space on. And so here's an example. And this goes, this is even a university example per se. Magellan's a device that Medtronic developed that delivers cells during open heart surgeries, I believe is why they originally developed it. FDA approved, on the market. Sold about 5 years ago. It was selling about $10 million a year for Medtronic. They were selling, so I'm guessing the instrument might have been $100,000. So they were selling, 100 of these a year. Medtronic, it was a failure to them. It was a complete dog, right? Medtronic's cost of capital, the market expects Medtronic to sell billion-dollar products. Medtronic's taken hundreds of millions of dollars from the street, from the public stocks, and they have to make, in exchange, several $100 million a year in profit, if not billions of profits, in order to maintain those expectations of its owners. So you can't have products that are making $10 million a year top line. So this was complete failure. They couldn't get rid of it soon enough. Arteriocyte was a startup company we created in 2004. It was a stem cell company. Arteriocyte became aware that Medtronic was trying to unload this dog of a product, which, again, to Medtronic was a dog. It was selling $10 million top line. The profit per year, the EBIT, right, the earnings before interest and taxes, were somewhere between $1 and $2 million. To Arteriocyte, that's huge. It's like, wait a minute, we can take on that product and sell it for you, and we'll bring in $10 million in revenue, and we'll have about $1 or $2 million of profit a year. My only other option is to go to Charter Life Sciences in Palo Alto, a venture fund, who's willing to give me $3 million basically in exchange for 90% of my company and take over complete control. So it's not that Magellan's a bad product. It works clinically. It's sold. It's making a profit. But if you're looking under the cost of capital of Medtronic, it's worthless to them because they have to deploy big money. If you're looking at relative to the cost of capital of a privately held startup company, it was an incredibly lucrative deal. So Arteriocyte did take on this project and sells it, and again is returning $1 or $2 million a year free cash flow and is loving life. But it's not about the technology. It's about what's the business opportunity and what does the market or the economic market expect for a return. Regulatory hurdles, right? There's very little pediatric innovation. It's really sad to see, but basically we receive next to no invention disclosures in the pediatric world, and if we do, we wouldn't be able to do anything with them because no one wants to take drugs or devices into kids. You may want to guess why? Two very strong reasons. Rick? Yeah, that's one, right? So, a device for kids, right? They're going to stay that size where it'll work for maybe 4 years. Meanwhile, if you're making a device for the adult population, it's going to fit that person for 60 years. So the market's just way too small. And then the second one is the ethics, right? Clinical trials are bad anyway. Nobody wants to kill a kid. So the sad part is the outcome is there's just no pediatric market. There's a complete lack of innovation or therapeutic opportunities for children. Opportunity costs, right? So startup companies, again, going back to the fact that if they're lucky and can raise some capital, they're going to have enough capital, or you have enough working cash, usually through investment or through an SBIR or some sort of partnership, to go for like one shot on goal. They may see a drug from Case or from their founder that really looks good too, but they just don't have the, it's just too much of a cost. They're a 4-person company. They have to focus on their one thing. So you can't always, it's not that they don't like your technology, it's just that they can't take it. So we have a sleep apnea invention that a company in the sleep apnea market loved, but they said, this will be our second generation. If our first generation works, we'll come back and license this from you. But right now we have to develop, we only have enough money to develop our first generation product. We think your thing will work, but it doesn't fit for us. Intellectual property uncertainty, right? We talked about patents in the dark period. If we filed a patent today for you, again, it'll be about 4 to 5 years, could be longer depending on, if it's gene versus software, et cetera, but it'll be several years until you know if that patent issues and you have any rights or not. You can't enforce a patent application. So until the USPTO says this is a valid patent, you have no ability to enforce it. Likewise, you'll have 2 years even of dark period in which you won't even have heard whether the examiner thinks this is the worst idea I've ever seen and 10 other groups have already done this, or it looks decent. So there's a lot of uncertainty. So in certain fields, it leads to risk that the financial markets can't accept. Stem cells got killed on this. Stem cells, 15 years ago, some of you may be a little too young, but everyone thought stem cells were going to cure everything, right? We had this placebo for every myriad, every myriad of conditions. We can cure paralysis, cancer, on and on. One of the things that really hurt the stem cell world was, first of all, I think the promise never panned out in the lab as well as they hoped it would. But secondly, it was just that every stem cell seemed to, since it can transform into another cell type, which is the utility of a stem cell, there was all this IP uncertainty of, how do I know my stem cell isn't transforming into something that's already patented by someone, and vice versa? And the USPTO got just inundated with hundreds of patents applications, and VCs were saying, we're done. Until someone sorts out this patent world, we can't. It's just too crazy to invest tens or hundreds of millions of dollars only to find out that Geron's going to come and say these are all just derivatives of our patent and you have no rights. A misalignment with comfort levels of licensor and licensees. This one again is at the university level is very important. We have ethical obligations and we also have press related. Again, we need to keep a reputation that's that is we're here to do good for society, not just to make money. And there are times when the outcome of the technology just doesn't work. So one of the things that happened maybe about 10 years ago is there was an HIV drug created at Yale. They licensed it to, I believe, Pfizer and Merck. Merck or Pfizer took it to market in the US. It was rather successful. Merck or Pfizer decided we're not going to take it to Africa. There's no money in Africa. Those people can't pay, and we're just not going to distribute it there. Well, Yale took a beating. They got sued by their own alumni foundation for embarrassing the alumni, saying you should have preserved the rights of the impoverished world. But you just went for money and sold it to Big Pharma, and you didn't force them to go into Africa, or at least you didn't restrict those rights, so you could have gave those to someone else who would, and now those people are dying and don't have access to this drug. So universities have to be very careful, again, that it's not just about money, but does it align with our comfort level of what we could want this to be. I'll give you a little more comical example, but it's very real. It's my previous boss. He cut his teeth and became famous at Carnegie Mellon in the 80s when tech transfer first really boomed in the IT world. And he was the co-founder of Lycos. Some of you may have seen Lycos. I think you can still find it online. It was one of the first web crawlers. They had trouble getting rid of Lycos or finding a commercial partner because at the time the university said you cannot use our web exchange or our web crawler, whatever it was, for pornography. That would be very embarrassing to CMU if it was ever used for pornography. Well, that's all anybody was using the internet for in about the 80s, I think. And they just couldn't find, it became impossible because VCs are saying, you can't put in censorship or that on our product. We either have rights to use it or not. But again, it was the university saying, we would hate to be seen as the group, our name's going to be, if you look in a window where it says about or Lycos, we don't want people saying that we've been seen as a channel to either pornography or illegal gambling, or so it can be very difficult for a university at times to say, do we want to make money or put this in the public hands, and if so, what's the right way to do it? Complementary technology requirements. I talked about the IP world with stem cells. The other problem is, what's the product, right? So if you have a stem cell, and let's assume you did have patents and you knew you had a freedom to operate and it worked clinically, how do you make money on that? Well, you say, well, you need a storage freezer, you need a delivery instrument, You need an antibody to separate those cells that you're creating from, the other cells that aren't stem cells. And you had this too many needs where you're saying, if we're going to make money in stem cells, there's a distribution system that doesn't exist because it's not like selling drugs where we just send them to a pharmacy. These have to be preserved. There's a question of who has the rights to filter them. And there were too many moving parts for a group to really get comfortable. So there are times, you may likewise, I remember in imaging, at the university level, somebody will show that you can use bacterial rhodopsin as a 3D storage technology. I remember in the late 80s seeing this and thought, this thing's the future, right? This thing's amazing. The problem was they did it one time in a university because they developed a blue laser that cost, at the time you couldn't do blue lasers, and it cost something crazy, $6 million that the feds had paid. There was no market. They said until somebody invents a cheap and marketable off-the-shelf blue laser, this optical storage technology can't go anywhere because we're beholden or required to have a complementary technology that we don't have the capability to develop, and until that exists or becomes economical, it kills our opportunity. And then reimbursement. I'd mentioned about cost of healthcare systems. Right now, some of the stuff coming out of imaging is amazing. I mean, like just the ooh factor when you look and go, that is so cool. I mean, we can track a drug, we can see it throughout the person, but feds don't want to pay for it sometimes. They say, great, it works scientifically, we understand clinically why it might be interesting to know this, but what's it mean in terms of clinical impact, in terms of total cost to the system? If it's adding cost instead of reducing it, we're not going to pay for it. If ultimately 90% of the people that get this still go forward with the next intervention, which is the current one, if it's great, this, but you still have to do a EP, a guided EP catheter-based electrophysiology, what's the point of doing the screen? And so again, a lot of, companion diagnostics, you hear about personalized medicine. Personalized medicine's phenomenal, right? It has this ability to tell you if a drug will work or that, but who wants to pay for that test? Pharma doesn't want it. They want you to take the drug regardless. So there's a lot of problems at times of who's going to pay? Are you just adding cost to the system? And so again, that's one of the reasons why, again, the technology works. It's beautiful. It's a great landmark in terms of what's happened scientifically, but we just can't find a way that this fits within the economics of the population. So spin-off companies, why do we do them? I mentioned the cultural and emotional value of the campus, to regents, to faculty. Sometimes I also mention it's the only way to keep going. It keeps the platform local. Sometimes we just say, man, the researcher says, I don't want this going to the West Coast. Let's create a company and keep it around. So those are reasons why we do it, right? Why do we say no? Again, I mentioned 4 or 5 a year, right? Management's crucial. Once it's a company, usually it's a C corporation, sometimes an LLC, but these are, formal corporations. They're for-profits. The university doesn't control them. Matter of fact, not only do we not control them, we're not allowed and we don't want to. Our general counsel's office would say, that's exposure. So it needs to be managed by an outside entity. Someone has to mind the store, right? We don't want our faculty quitting and going to run the company. So, can we find that manager who knows how to develop the technology and can create value? That's, I'd say, our biggest bottleneck right now in town. People have always thought it was money. It's, can we get early stage capital? I mentioned how hard and how expensive it is. That's number 2, but it's not number 1. It's harder to just find a talented CEO who can run that first company or in its early stages. The economic return is highly volatile. I mean, if you were going to do it just for the money and you're going to ignore the cultural and the PR opportunities, you probably wouldn't do them. Because again, they rarely make money. We created, I think we have probably 30 companies in the last 8.5 years since I've been here. Several we're very proud of. I'd like to own stock personally. They're doing well. They're 80 employees of that. None have cashed out. We've had no liquidations other than cashed out, going out of business, right? So it takes a long time in the biomedical world. Even success is even if you are successful, it's going to be 8 to 12 years. Athersys finally went public a few years ago via reverse IPO. They were one of the cases startups from the 90s. They think it took them 14 years. I mean, it's a very long time to return. And then we mentioned a conflict of interest, and conflict of interests are worse, or at least they're more complicated when you have an institutional conflict of interest, when not only did you have the invention, but you own equity in that company. And it's seen as, when you don't want the headline reading that a Case Western Reserve University company was involved in fraud. So immediately there's a little more exposure. So If you like this world, you know, you're on the right track. Most of our people, if not all of them, have some sort of advanced life science degree, at the very least a bachelor's, and usually it's either in biology or molecular biology, a couple PhDs, most have MBAs. We don't have lawyers, we sort of outsource to lawyers, if you will, but some offices also keep on staff. You know, pretty much the same thing. And we'll skip on that, but these slides are more than open to you. If you ever have, you know, interest, questions, feel free to let us know. I think a lot of this stuff's ancillary, or not ancillary, it's important. It's why we do it rather than how we do it. But at the very end, please feel free to contact me or my team if you either have questions about the field or about a given invention or your rights. We're here to serve. Okay.
Anyone have any last questions?
Any questions, please?
All right. Then I'll let you actually have a break, but I'll mention something about this when we come back. But our next